I did. Anyone else not receive it? No? Okay, let me see if I can send it again. Check your junk folder. Sometimes, for some reason, they get labeled as.
I just sent it to you. Yep.
Switch over.
It's front door, back door?
Yep.
Because you earn in 60 days, you get in-store credit.
It's not as good as last.
All right. Go ahead and pull up the front door, back door spreadsheet that I sent to you, I believe, yesterday. The blank version.
That's not something to get.
Yeah, that sounds like, you know.
Okay, so I got it pulled up.
New laptop for this one.
Okay, everybody got a copy of the handout? One-page handout. Yep. Okay, so here's the plan for today. This is what I call a simple financial feasibility analysis model, okay? And so that's what the SFFA stands for, okay? The two approaches are the front door approach and the back door approach. Now, normally, whenever I teach the development class, the development process class, this is usually the first things that I start out with, and this is probably, actually I'm not going to say probably, I would say this is probably the most important model of the entire program, okay? This is literally where everything all fits together in one nice little package of whenever you're trying to make the decision as to potentially proceed with a project or to push it off to the side and say it's it's really not feasible, okay? So what we do with this model is we collect information. Specifically, we collect information related to the size of the property, the purchase price of the property, the purchase price of the land, if we are building from ground up. We also need to collect, things like what the occupancy or vacancy rate is for this particular property type. We need to collect what the rental rates are per square foot for the property type. We need to be able to collect, what the lending criteria for the property is going to be, what sort of loan to value, what sort of interest rate, what sort of term. And we need to sort of take into consideration what maybe operating expenses are going to be with the property, what our debt service coverage ratio is going to be, and a couple of other variables. So there's literally 10 or so different variables that we need to kind of collect. And then once we've collected those variables for a particular property, we're able to put them into a model like this and be able to very easily sort of spit out something that's going to be useful to us. Well, with the model on the top, what we're doing is as it sort of terms of the front door approach, we're starting with, okay, here's what our site is going to cost us in terms of the site acquisition. Let me blow this up a little bit so, once again, folks can maybe see it a little bit easier. Blow the top part here.
So is this like a pro forma?
No, the top part is not. The bottom part sort of is. Okay, so once again, the first variable that we start off with the front door approach is we start off with what is basically the land cost, the site acquisition piece, okay? Now with this, I tend to go ahead and put in with the site acquisition cost any other sort of fees associated with, like if you've got to get it rezoned, if you've got to basically get it replatted, if you've got to come in and do some dirt work and you know, infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. To me, that is the site acquisition cost. Okay, so it's land cost plus all those other sort of costs to get the dirt ready to build on. Then construction cost, I then typically sort of say that those are the costs affiliated with actually building whatever the structure is. Okay, from in this case, you know, kind of from a slab all the way up. Okay, so that's kind of how I break it out. Now, granted, you could get more, much more sophisticated than that, but these are, for the most part, rough numbers, okay? These are not meant to be the super precise numbers that are going to go into a more detailed kind of analysis or pro forma, okay? This is what I like to call, this is kind of the first blush. This is the sort of thing that you collect some very basic pieces of information and you're able to make the initial sort of go, no-go kind of decision, okay? Does that make sense, everybody? So, what this model does is you can see over here on the left-hand side, the math is already there for you, okay, telling you what you need to do, whether you need to add, subtract, multiply, divide, or whatever. In other words, site acquisition cost plus construction cost equal total expected development cost. Make sense? Okay, so and then the next line down, multiply that by the loan-to-value ratio, that's going to give us our permanent mortgage. Multiply that by our annualized mortgage constant, that's going to give us the cash required for our debt service, and so forth, so on, all the way down the page. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, we're going to put in some numbers, we're going to test it, and then talk about, you know, kind of each of those variables as we kind of go through the process. Does that make sense, everybody? But the end result of this first model, the front door approach, is putting in all that information gets us down to this line 17, which is in essence what we're really searching for, which is what would be the rent required per square foot for this property to basically work for us, given all of those preconditions. So before I even put any numbers up there, let's say that the rent required per square foot based upon this model is $15, okay? So I want you to think with me for a second. So let's say the number that gets shot back here is $15 per square foot for the rent required per square foot for this particular property. So if we go out into the market and we find similar properties, and all of those properties are leasing at $20 a square foot, what does that say about this particular property that we're analyzing? What?
Feasible.
It's very feasible, because we've got a $5 gap, if you will, because we only need to get $15 a square foot, but the market on average is $20 a square foot. So without question, we're probably sitting on a project that makes a lot of sense. Okay? On the flip side, if we go out into the market and the average property is at $10 a square foot, okay, in terms of lease rates, then we've got to really think hard as to whether or not this property has any chance whatsoever in being successful. Now, granted, you can adjust a good number of these assumptions, you know, and to a certain extent to try to see if there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of getting the property to go from potentially not being, you know, a project that you would move forward with to one that is. But you'd be very careful about that as, you know, a developer from the standpoint, you don't want to overestimate your revenues. You don't want to underestimate your expenses. Okay? I mean, it's very basic math in the sense of just kind of understanding that. The tendency, on the other hand, by a lot of developers is to do what? Be very pompous and arrogant and very kind of, you know, thinking that they can get any rent that they possibly could get, you know, on a particular property and don't really want to pay attention to what the market dynamics are actually telling them. Okay, so this is meant to be very much of a, kind of a very objective way of being able to kind of analyze a property. Okay, that makes sense to everybody? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, the flip side to the front door approach is the back door approach. Okay, now with the back door approach, you start with knowing what your total square footage of the building is going to be that you want to either build or acquire, what your rents that you're going to be able to charge, okay, based on what you have determined from the market and based on this property, or maybe even the historical information from this property if it's an existing property. And then you're going to kind of just go down the income statement in terms of the income and so forth, and then you're going to basically say, okay, well, this is the kind of loan I can get on this property and so forth, so on. And what this model is going to spit out is basically how much you could actually spend on the property in terms of what dollar amount you could spend in terms of an acquisition price for the property if it's already built. And then if it's not already built, then you would subtract out effectively what your estimated construction costs are to tell you what the maximum amount you could spend on the land would be. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just two different ways of kind of approaching the problem. Okay, that's the reason why it's called the front door and back door, is just simply two different mechanisms of kind of getting at kind of the same answer. Now, what you typically are going to do, you may use both approaches and just kind of, see if you sort of need to kind of reconcile anything. But many of the variables on the two different approaches are the same. It's just a question of which direction you're sort of going with. Okay, make sense? Now the model, or the handout that I gave you, is just, there's nothing, incredibly unique about this, but what I've tried to do is basically the model that on the top gives you a required rent per square foot of $17.49, okay, based upon all of those criteria that are listed there under the front door approach. So what I do then on the back door approach in this particular case is I sort of say, okay, let's sort of round that off to $17.50 and then kind of work back the other direction and see if everything matches up. And what you see is it matches up almost precisely. And the only reason it doesn't match up absolutely precisely is because of that minor rounding difference between the $17.49 and $17.50, because it's actually somewhere in between the two. So, but what you see is at the very bottom, the maximum amount you could spend on land under the backdoor approach would be $250,597, whereas on the front door approach, you're basically $250,000 even. Okay, so the only reason for that almost $600 difference is that rounding. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, and then the bottom part of this model, which we may or may not get to today, and is the beginnings of a basic sort of pro forma, okay, in terms of just the year-to-year sort of before tax cash flow model that we would use with the same sort of data. But the primary goal for today is to get us through basically the front door and the back door approach, and that's obviously what the spreadsheet completion quiz will be based on, okay? So it's only going to be based on these first two, not on the bottom one, okay? All right. So, with that, any questions before we get started? Okay, so you should have the model pulled up. All right, now this model, I did it a little bit differently in one sense than kind of some of the previous models that we did. And the difference is here, the colored cells, the green cells on your screen are the actual input cells, not the formula cells. So it's just the opposite of the previous models. And the reason I did that was simply because for this particular model, it made a little bit more sense to do it that way, okay? So there's no absolute that you've got to do it one way or the other or have them colored at all. I just do that just for my own kind of keeping it straight in my head as to what is an input versus what is an actual calculation. So what we can do to begin with is for each of these input cells, we can go ahead and just start by putting in the information that I've provided you on the sheet. Oops, if I can type it myself. So 250,000 $750,000. We're going to leave everything else blank. We're just going to type in just the parts that are in green. There's a method to my madness on this, so just go ahead and right now don't do any of the others. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for the backdoor approach. Just type in all the givens. Okay, so once we get all those typed in, okay, let's go back up to, once again, the top one. All right. So what I would like for you to do is on your own, attempt to go ahead and fill in the remainder, okay? I mean, once again, most of them, the only one that you should have any difficulty with is the annualized mortgage constant. All the others are just adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. So let's just see if you can go ahead and do the math to calculate the remaining cells. Bruce, is there a problem? You? What? Oh. Once again, you're looking for the check figures. Obviously, you've got the sheet to be able to help you out. Okay. Okay, to help you out, I'll go ahead and show you the formula here for the annualized mortgage contract. We're going to go through it together, but I'm just going to go ahead and pop it up there. So once again, that should be the only one you really get hung up on. All the others should be, once again, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing.
I have that, but I have 0.08 something. I don't know why.
sorry?
I have that same formula, but I came out with 0.08.
Did you multiply by 12?
Yeah, then.
Okay, just out of curiosity, how many people have gotten at least all the way down to line 17? Anybody? Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Good. Okay, so let me go through and just kind of explain each piece as we sort of work down the model, all right? So it should be pretty straightforward. If you did everything correctly, you should get to 17.49. All right, now, let's just start off. Once again, I've already talked a little bit about the site acquisition cost. That as I said, I would tend, as a potential investor, developer, would say the site acquisition cost would be any and all costs affiliated with basically buying the land, getting the land entitled, doing any sort of site preparation work in terms of putting in infrastructure, utilities, all of that sort of stuff. That's what I would consider site acquisition cost. Then construction cost, as I said, that would specifically be those costs affiliated with building the actual physical structure on the land. Now, if you buy a property, and once again, sometimes people will ask the question, well, what if I'm buying a property and it's not separated? In other words, I'm just buying a building that's already been built, then you could just skip over really the site construction cost and just put in the total amount as your construction cost, or just put in the total amount of your development cost as your whole acquisition. I mean, there's a variety of ways you could do that, or you could sort of say, all right, let me go to the county assessors and take a look at how they value the land, use that as maybe a basis for the land value, and then the remaining amount that you're going to put in on your purchase price would be affiliated with the construction cost, okay? Or potentially if you get the land valued by an appraiser and then try to separate out the value of the improvements, that'd be yet another way. So the point is simply you've got to start off with your total investment value, whatever that is, okay? Land and improvements, okay? Is everybody cool with that? Any questions on that piece? Okay? Now, the next piece, as we're sort of working from there, is once we know what the acquisition price of the land is going to be, then we're going to go to a lender, all right? And we're going to say, all right, what kind of a loan is this lender willing to give us? And usually one of the first things that we start with the commercial lender is the loan to value ratio, all right? And most lenders, if you were to Google right now, commercial lenders, and you kind of start tooling around with kind of what the loan terms are going to be, you're probably going to see lenders be fairly explicit about what their loan terms are. You know, 60% loan to value ratio, 70% loan to value ratio, 80% loan to value ratio, depending on the property type, depending on the geographic location, depending on the quality, depending on a whole number of factors. But ultimately, that's a piece of information you need to be able to source, okay? Does that make sense? Okay? All right, so once you've got that loan to value ratio, then you're able to do the simple math of taking $1 million of the total development cost, multiplying it by the 80% loan to value ratio, and that's simply telling us that we've got a permanent mortgage amount of $800,000, okay? Which means, just to make sure you're paying attention to me, what does that mean our equity is?
20%.
20% or what dollar amount? 200,000. Okay, good. All right, now, this next piece for the permanent mortgage. We've got the two input variables of 5% interest rate, loan term of 15 years. Same sort of thing that I was talking about with the loan to value ratio, we're going to be doing with those two pieces of information. We're going to find a lender, we're going to find out what their standard normal terms are in terms of the interest rate, in terms of the loan term. Now the beautiful part, of course, about this model is we can constantly change it, you know, and instantly change it so that any of those, you know, things that we want to sort of take a look at, like for example, what if, let's just kind of use this as a what if scenario, that we go to a lender and we find another lender that says, we'll give you a 90% loan to value, but we're going to charge you a 7% interest rate for 30 years. Okay? Well, if that's the case, that changes our bottom line as to the rent level that we've actually got to achieve on the property in order for it to be feasible. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's one of the very valuable kind of pieces of analysis with this, is it allows you to do that kind of sensitivity analysis to be able to get a sense for, you know, what are going to be the key influencers on the rental rates that you're going to need to achieve, or working it the other way, the key influencers on, you know, how much you can pay for a property. Okay, make sense? All right, so let me put those values back to what they were so we don't confuse things. Okay. And then one other piece of information that we need to get from our lender is the debt coverage ratio. All right? And I believe we've talked about this, but if we haven't, let me go ahead and make sure that I talk about it. So the debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, also sometimes abbreviated just to DCR, debt coverage ratio, is equal to the net operating income, and this is annual net operating income that a property generates, divided by, in this case, the
Annual debt service?
the annual debt service. Brain just went blank. Okay, divided by the annual debt service, which is simply your principal and interest for the loan over the course of a year. So in this particular instance, and we're going to come back to the annualized mortgage constant here in just a second. So what we're saying is that we've got the cash required for the debt service, in this case of basically $75,916.19, and we know that our maximum debt service coverage ratio, or minimum debt service coverage ratio that our lender will allow is a 1.3. So that allows us to back into this annual net operating income, which in this case is the $98,691.04. Now, what does this number actually mean, the DSCR? It is, in essence, sort of the cushion that the lender requires in order for a loan to be made, all right? So, in essence, what the lender is saying, that if you remember back to our sort of traditional and an operating statement where we've got potential gross income, we subtract out, in this case, vacancies and collection losses, we add in other income, that gives us effective gross income, subtract out total operating expenses, which gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, that gives us, in this case, before tax cash flow. All right? Well, the piece that we're actually focusing on with this is the net operating income, which is the $98,691.04, and then the lender, by virtue of what we have done above, has limited us to $75,916.19. And so once again, the relationship between these two is the debt service coverage ratio. Does that make sense? So the point is the lender is really concerned with, to a certain extent, what that number is, because they want to ensure that there's more than ample amount of money for them to be paid the amount that they're owed of the $75,000. Does that make sense? Okay, so just do a quick math. It'll be $22,774.85 would be our before tax cash flow. But the point is that for this annual debt service, the lender is basically saying, after you have paid all of your bills and you're left with this $98,000, that you've got to pay us the $75,000, but after that, you're still going to be left with hopefully sufficient, more than sufficient cash flows that in the event something up here hasn't worked out, there's enough money left over to pay us as the lender. That's the whole idea behind the debt service coverage ratio. Now, if we were to lower, let's just see what would happen. If we were to lower the debt service coverage ratio to just 1, okay? By doing that, that basically is saying we're going to allow you to have just enough income to pay us, okay? And if that's the case, there's not going to be any money left over. It's going to be 0 down here for before tax cash flow. Well, if you're the lender, would you want that to happen?
No.
Because you're going to be afraid that there's going to be a miscalculation of these expenses and not be enough money down there. Okay? So the higher that you raise the debt service coverage ratio above 1 just simply means that you are being more risk adverse as a lender, meaning that you want to simply ensure there's going to be adequate or more than adequate money for you to be paid. Okay? Yep.
So is that like kind of like saying the lender requires that you make a 30% profit in order for them to?
It's one way to look at it. I tend to sort of think of it as it's an income cushion. I don't like calling it profit because to me I mean, it is your before tax cash flow, yes. But that's not inherently profit, but it's just the lender's perspective, not the investor's perspective.
So revenue?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, it's revenue. Okay, somebody, Jarvis?
Yeah, what's the lowest that you've ever seen this?
I mean, talking about like for a just absolutely top shelf, class A, everything is wonderful, 1.1.
But what's the high? What's the spectrum that you've seen?
I've seen it as high as like 1.6, 1.7.
And is it dependent on property type or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
What about
I mean, I would say the normal, let's put it this way. For many years, the normal range was like between probably 1.2 to 1.3.
Okay.
And anytime you start to hit rough times in the economy, then it tends to go up a little bit more to like 1.4, you know, in some cases 1.5 in really horrible situations. Dustin, would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay, so, all right. So let's put it back here, but take a look at what it's, just that one variable change though, and what impact that has on the rent required per square foot. So if the lender is really, obviously, very comfortable with you not having any extra cash laying around, that means that you could have actually had a much lower rental rate on your property because you don't have to have as much money laying around to basically keep them happy. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's go back for a second. Let me go ahead and put that back to 1.3. Since I skipped over the annualized mortgage constant here for a second. Okay? All right. So any questions up to this point? Yep.
All right, so what about the experience of the investor? So there's no way for, like, let's say an investor to come in and kind of negotiate?
No, it's possible. I mean, you know, once again, every lender is different.
Right.
But most of them tend to have fairly standard, structured kind of loan programs available. I mean, even on the construction side, I mean, even though that there can be a lot of variation, there's usually, as a matter of standard practice, there's going to be some fairly consistent standards that lender's going to apply. That whenever, because what happens as a matter of course is that with virtually any loan, you know, whether it's a development loan, construction loan, it's going to go to a bank and it's going to go through basically a loan committee. Okay, that loan committee made up of different, you know, bank officers. They're going to, you know, be given the documentation regarding this loan and all the backup material, and they're going to sit around and they're, to a certain extent, going to make a decision. You know, number one, should we make this loan, yes or no? But also, you know, what sort of conditions, you know, or provisions are we going to require, even maybe above and beyond these sort of stated criteria? And they're going to take into account things like, okay, well, you know, how many other projects has this particular person done within this particular community? How successful have they been? Have they ever defaulted? You know, what do we think, you know, that the outlook is for this particular product type? Yada, yada, yada. So it's one of those things that it's, well, it's not absolute, but even without it being absolute, there's still going to be what I would call an operational sort of range of where those numbers are going to be. But in other words, you're never going to have it way up here, you're never going to have it way down here. It's going to be somewhere in that range, but that's part of the stress test that you know, would put on the model. That whenever they come back to you, like as an example, they come back to you, this is your estimate, okay? You take it to them, and they come back to you and they say, there's no way we're going to accept a 1.3, we demand a 1.4, okay, for the debt coverage ratio. There's no way that we're going to accept a 5% interest rate, we're going to demand a 7% interest rate. There's no way we're going to do a 15-year term, we're going to do a 10-year term. Well, you adjust the model.
Right.
And then, based on that, what's it going to tell you? You know, whether or not the project is more feasible or less feasible. Okay? All right. So once again, going back to the mortgage constant here for a second. Okay. As I told the real estate finance class this morning with respect to this, and we're going to kind of repeat so I get to hear it the second time, about mortgage constants. Okay. Stop. Okay. Mortgage constants. The way that I explained it this morning, and we'll explain the same thing this afternoon, is many years ago, a lot of textbooks included all these tables at the end of the books, specifically these present value tables, future value tables, and present value and annuity tables, and also mortgage constant tables. And the purpose of these tables was kind of predating the traditional financial calculator. They had already calculated the values for a number of these sort of financial calculations, so that all you would have to do is know the loan amount, multiply it by the mortgage constant to be able to get your monthly payment or annual payment. And the point is that the mortgage constants are going to be based on whatever the interest rate is and the term. Okay? And so what you're doing in terms of, if we want to look at it from the kind of the perspective of the calculator here for a second, you're going to be putting in, let's say 12 payments per year, and you're going to put in an interest rate, in this case, let's say a 5%, a term of 15 years, and then you're going to put $1 as your loan amount or your present value. And then you're going to solve for what is the payment. Now the payment that you get here is going to be your monthly mortgage constant, which is you're going to multiply by 12 in order to get our annual mortgage constant. All right, so let's just do this first piece.
Let's leave it.
Okay, so the monthly mortgage constant is going to be negative 0.079079336 and some change, okay? We're just going to multiply that by 12. That gives us 0.09489523552, okay? Now, and this is the annualized mortgage constant compounded monthly. All right? Now, that number should match up with what we have up here on the screen in terms of the calculation that Excel did for us, in terms of this number right here. Now, what we can do with that number, and this is the part kind of where the application aspect of this sort of comes into play, is that we can take this number, the annual mortgage constant, and multiply it by our loan amount, and that is going to give us our total loan payment, in this case, our annual loan payment for the mortgage. So the beautiful part with this mortgage constant is we can put in this 0.09489 and change, and then we can pick any loan amount, $1, $100,000, whatever, and then that will instantly give us what our loan amount is. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, why would we care about even calculating this annualized mortgage constant if we have a financial calculator and we've got Excel? Any ideas? Well, in one sense, you don't have to, but there is an interesting aspect to it. Because what this is actually telling you, and this is the part where hopefully the headlights begin to sort of come on, this number is really the percent of the loan amount that you're paying each year. There's another way to look at it. So if you've got a $100,000 loan, you're actually paying 9.48% of that each year. Now, make sure that I'm very clear about what I just said. That is the amount that you are paying each year. That is not the amount you are paying off each year. Okay? Now, the difference is this is your payment. Okay? In other words, the amount you're paying in terms of your payment. It is not the amount of principal that's being repaid. It's not the amount of interest. It's the combined principal and interest that you're paying each year. So another way of kind of looking at this, you obviously want to minimize your annualized mortgage constant. And so through the combination of saying, okay, what's the lowest interest rate that I can get? Okay, well, let me ask you, before I just say what I'm about to say, you've got two variables that comprise the mortgage constant, the interest rate and the term. Okay? If I wanted to get the lowest possible mortgage constant, what would I do about these two variables? In other words, which one would be high, which one would be low? Or would both be high, would both be low?
High terms, low interest.
Okay? You would get a high term or long term, and you would get a low interest rate. Okay? That's going to give you the lowest overall mortgage constant, or lowest overall cost of borrowing.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay, now, one of the interesting little nifty things that I had forgotten I'd actually embedded in this was if you go down here to the bottom and you click on sheet 1, this is a mortgage constant table. Okay? Now, you can't really read them all on my screen, but you should be able to read them on your screen. But what we've got over here on the left column, or the left row, the left column is right, are interest rates ranging from 1% all the way down to, I don't know what the highest one was, 12%?
Yeah.
Okay, and then up here, obviously, running across the top, you've got terms ranging from 5-year terms all the way to 30-year terms. And then what you can see is, in essence, just what I pretty much described. The lowest overall cost of borrowing is a 30-year term with a 1% interest rate. And then everything else just kind of grows significantly, obviously, as you go kind of down and to the left. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So the beautiful part about this table is instantly we can go up there and say, okay, for a 15-year loan with a 7% interest rate, 15-year loan, 7% interest rate would be a mortgage constant of 0.10785939925. Okay, and then we can take that number, replace what's here, multiply by a loan amount, and then instantly calculate a monthly or an annual payment. Does it make sense? Yes? Okay. Okay, so that gets us down, if we will, to, we talked about the debt coverage ratio, we got to the NOI. All right, so this next little piece. Now this is the part, for this part of the model, that is going to make the least amount of sense to many of you. And because it's backward logic, okay? And you'll see what I'm saying here in just a second. Once you understand the backward logic, then it all makes sense. It's very straightforward. Okay? Now, what do I mean by the backward logic? Well, if you remember what I was saying earlier, you know, a normal pro forma, potential gross income minus vacancies and collection losses plus other income gives us effective gross income, subtract out total operating expenses, gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, gives us before tax cash flow, and so forth, so on. Okay? Well, we have gotten kind of to this point right here where we've got, in this case, our net operating income, we said, of $98,691.04, and we also have our debt service coverage, or our debt service, of $75,916. Okay, and then we can go ahead and calculate our before tax cash flow. Hopefully we have to. We've already done this before, but I'm going to do it again. Okay. Double check. 22,774.85. Okay. All right. So what I'm talking about with the backward logic is this. Okay, so we have been working kind of from this direction, moving up the income statement, okay, instead of going down the income statement. So in this case, we are now being told, the next piece of information that we're being told is, what is the estimated operating expenses not passed through to the tenants? $50,000. That's this number right here. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Well, what are we solving for after we do that?
PGI.
We're basically just going up kind of the food chain. You see? Required effective gross income. So what we're saying is we're adding this to get this. Okay? I mean, obviously reverse, because it's not going to be this minus this to get this. It's going to be this plus this to get this. Does that make sense? Once again, the reverse logic I'm talking about. Okay, so that gives us 148 $691.04. Okay? Going up. All right? Now then, we don't have anything for other income. I left that as 0 and didn't even put it into the model because it really didn't need to. But what I did put in there was, okay, what about our vacancies and collection law? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going back to the estimated operating expense.
Yep.
Is that just essentially expenses that you don't put into your rent, that you don't charge your tenants rent for? And then what, is there like a traditional cost, or is that just the landlord's?
It's up to the property owner as to a certain extent, what they're gonna pass through the tenants and what they are going to be responsible for. And this gets into the whole discussion of basically gross leases versus net leases. And we'll do a quick little primer on it. So basically, at one end of the spectrum, we have gross leases. Okay? Which is what I would tend to term, it's an all bills paid situation for the tenant. All bills paid, I'm going to put by landlord for tenant. Okay? Over here, on the other end of the extreme, I would have what I would call an absolute, oops, it's spelled. Try again, okay. Triple net lease, okay? This is simply where the tenant pays every bill on property for owner or landlord. And I think we've already talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the point with the model here is we're saying that $50,000, so we don't have a situation of where it is, you know, if the landlord is having to actually pay $50,000, then that means that it's definitely not an absolute triple net. Okay, it means it's somewhere beyond a triple net, maybe not a gross, but somewhere kind of in this middle ground of basically, you know, some form of a net lease, or it could be a gross lease, you know, for that matter. We're not really defining what it is with that $50,000. It's just simply that is an expense that is being borne by the property owner and not passed through to the tenants. So they're not being reimbursed for it, is what I'm trying to say. And so this could very well be a situation of where the property owner has simply said, you're going to pay me a monthly rent, but I'm going to take care of paying the property taxes on the building, I'm going to take care of paying the insurance on the building, I'm going to take care of all maintenance and repairs on the building, but you're still going to take care of utilities.
Would like a side effect of, I guess, of absolute triple net lease be that like the tenant doesn't take care of the property as well
No,
as they should?
not necessarily. There's usually going to be a maintenance agreement contract of some sort that's going to specify, you know, what their responsibilities are, you know, in terms of routine maintenance, or there may very well be a third party that provides all those services to the site that the tenant just has to pay for.
I was just thinking, like, say the lease is up in a month and like a pipe still.
Let me make sure that I'm clear though. On an absolute triple net lease, most of these properties, what we're talking about Class A, or not actually Class A, but we're talking about very high quality tenants in the sense that a lot of like big box stores, retailers that like a Walgreens or a CVS or something like that,
Okay.
that they're basically, and you know, this is a whole other discussion, but they're basically buying the site, developing the site, getting it occupied with their business, and then selling it off to a third-party investor that accepts this absolute triple net lease that they simply make cash flow payments to for the next 25, 30 years.
And I guess it's not common among residential properties? Because that's just sort of where
I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
I mean, you could, I suppose, I don't know. It's all a question of how far can you go as the property owner to shift as many costs onto the tenant as
Yeah.
possible? Yeah, is ideal from the property owner's perspective.
Yeah.
You know, from the tenant's perspective, just the opposite. You know, how many responsibilities can you shift to the owner? And so there is a negotiation there that's going to be able to take place between an owner and a tenant as to who's responsible for what. And, you know, my suspicion, or not suspicion, but, you know, the reality is that if you look at retail leases, like with whether it's in a mall or a, you know, a small neighborhood shopping center, that probably no two of those leases are going to be absolutely identical.
Yeah.
Each one's going to have some minor variations, in some cases major variations, because some, maybe a national tenant, they're able to come in with a lot of power and authority and pretty much dictate what they're going to do to the owner of the property. And then you're going to have the local mom and pop tenants that, you know, are just kind of at the whim of whatever that property owner chooses to do. I mean, would you describe it any different?
No, I agree. I just add on some of it. Walgreens, a lot of times they'll just pay the real estate taxes directly, so the landlord doesn't have to go through the problem of remembering to pay at the end of the year or whatever.
Yeah.
And then by different product type, you have different customary spread of those expenses. You know, in a Class A office tower, it's usually a full service gross lease. That'll include everything. But a smaller office building, where you have package units and the AC, the tenant might be responsible for AC maintenance.
So you're able to shift, like the, I guess, burden or the responsibility of taxes to the tenant instead of the owner?
Yeah.
I mean, and see, that's another interesting component of this, and that is sometimes it's not intuitively obvious to the casual observer, and I like that term, intuitively obvious to the casual observer, what the real cost of occupancy is on a property from just looking at an informational flyer put out by a property owner or management firm. Because what I mean by that is, what if you have a building, whether it's a, you know, this is like a shopping center as an example. A lot of the inline stores, you know, as was saying, you know, are maybe going to have their own individual air conditioning units, you know, package units that are going to just serve just their store. Okay, so they're probably going to pay their own utility bill in most cases. But what if, whenever the developer was developing that they chose to put the most energy inefficient air conditioning imaginable in the property? They did an absolutely horrific job with the insulating of the property. They did a horrible job in terms of the glazing on the windows for the store that let in every possible heat, you know, gain kind of thing imaginable. So they almost created a pressure cooker environment that has to have the air conditioning running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to try to get it to cool down. Okay, so they've got a massive cost for their, you know, electric bill every single month because of that situation. Versus some developer across the street developed almost an identical shopping center, but put extremely energy efficient air conditioning, extremely effective glazing on the outside of the building, great, you know, insulation, you know, so their electric bill is maybe 20% of what this guy's electric bill is. Well, the true cost of occupancy needs to include that.
Yeah.
And so, but this guy over here that has the really energy inefficient building, he may be charging a lower stated rental rate because he didn't have very high development cost to actually basically have a crappy building. Versus the one over here is charging a higher lease rate, but part of the reason he should be able to capture that higher lease rate is because your energy costs are going to be a lot less. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, that's just one kind of, I'm trying to make, you know, an extreme example so that, you know, hopefully it sinks in.
Right.
But the general idea is just simply that the true cost of occupancy on a per square foot basis is sometimes a very difficult number to get at, especially prior to the lease actually taking place. Now, you've got historical, you know, operating information, you know, for the property that they're willing to turn over prior to you signing the lease, or they're willing to, you know, once again, allow you to put the burden on them, then that, you know, something that kind of be dealt with. But my point is just that no two properties are identical whenever it comes to those true cost of occupancy. Anything you want to add to that?
Just a little question,
Yep.
might be getting into too much detail here, but, in a scenario where like the tenant assumes responsibility for the taxes and whatnot, are
Yep.
they liable for not paying your taxes?
Yes. Well, indirectly. I mean, the owner of the property is still going to be held liable,
Right.
but the tenant would be held liable to the owner,
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
okay?
We owe the government.
I mean, ultimately, the government's gonna get their money,
Yeah,
and they're gonna come to you as the owner of the property first.
right.
And then you're gonna say, well, my tenant didn't pay me, and they're gonna say, we don't care, you know? So, but the end game is the tenant's gonna have to pay you as the property owner in order to pay off the property taxes.
So is it riskier?
It's,
Depends on the credit of the tenant.
yeah,
And it also increases the value of a single tenant, triple net lease as an investment, because the guys that buy that kind of stuff just want to put the money to bed and not think about it.
right,
And they'll have to remember to pay on all 50 properties they own across the country.
precisely.
The different municipalities and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a whole thing of, you know, you're trying to solve problems for different people. You know, in the sense of what he's saying, you're trying to make it easier for maybe the owners because they don't want to have to think about it. They don't want to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, and say, oh, did I pay the property taxes this year? Or, oh, did I pay the, you know, utility bill this month? Or, oh, did I, you know, do any of that? You're just sort of able to kind of deflect that, you know, onto the tenant. But hopefully there's some sort of a check and balance system in place that you're gonna know if they didn't pay it.
Yeah.
Because that would be the worst case scenario kind of thing, is that they didn't pay it, you didn't know about it, and then all of a sudden you get a tax lien foreclosure that begins to happen on your property because, you know, they didn't pay the bill, and you've got penalties and assessments that are gonna come due as a result of that.
Would you pay your taxes at different times depending on where you are? I've never had a house.
I guess every jurisdiction's a little bit different. I mean, all the property I own is in Texas, and I just know from my own personal experience that all property taxes in Texas, if you make a payment, you can make a half payment at the end of November for the prior year, and then you make the other half in like June. Or you have to pay all of it by the end of January. So it's kind of, that's how their system is set up.
Yeah.
Here, I'm not 100% sure.
I think November is just the.
You get a discount if you do it by November.
Okay, well, that's basically the same sort of thing, okay, or, you know, when does the final payment due? Is it due January 31st?
March, yeah.
March, okay. Okay, moving forward. We're back. All right, so now, what we've got after this, we've got the 148,691. We don't have any other income that we've put into this model, all right? But what we do have is an occupancy rate for basically this model to be able to calculate our potential gross income. We don't need, in the model itself, to actually calculate the line item here for the vacancy and collection loss. All we really need to do, or all we really do in the model, is we simply take the 148,691 and we divide that by the expected occupancy rate of the 0.85, and then the resulting answer from that is our potential gross income. Does that make sense? Okay,
Right.
simple math, all right? So basically, and to prove the math, I'll show you one. So 148,691.04 divided by 0.85 gives us 174,930.64. Okay. Now, if we wanted to find out what the actual vacancy and collection loss was, we can approach it, you know, one of a couple of ways. One, we can just simply take this minus this, and that's going to give us that. Or we can just simply take this times
1 minus, or,
0.15, because the vacancy and collection loss is basically 15%, the occupancy is 85%, so it's just obviously 1 minus the occupancy rate, and so we should get 26,239.59.60, and then that, once again, if we subtract that out, it should give us this. Okay, make sense? Yep. Okay. Now, so that gets us to our required gross revenue of the 174,930.64. Okay, so from here, all we're doing is we're simply saying, what is the amount of leasable square feet that we have in our property? And that is, you know, once again, just what is the actual physical space? Now, this is an interesting point of discussion. In this case, we're calling it leasable square feet. We can also, there are a lot of different little terms here that we could use. We could use gross building area. That's not the same as leasable square feet, okay? Gross building area, kind of walk you through this a little bit. I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I just want to sort of illustrate my point. So let's just say that we've got a building and the interior space of this building from inside wall to inside wall with no partitions whatsoever is pretty much, I guess, 100 feet by 100 feet, okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Interior wall to interior wall, okay? It's like measuring from here to there, and there to there, okay? So 100 feet in both directions. Now, that would mean 100 times 100 should be 10,000, this little box with a line through it, square feet. 10,000 square feet for the building. And I would consider that to be leasable square feet. Does everybody understand? Now, we're going to do a couple of different little things. One is the gross building area might be a little bit more than that because walls aren't necessarily paper thin. Okay, like take for example, you know, these walls. Okay, if we actually go from the wall, from this part, all the way out to the exterior cladding on the outside of the building, it's at least 1 foot thick. Okay. Now that's not going to make a huge difference with this particular building, but some buildings it would. So that really means what? That from here, kind of to here, in terms of the outer wall, okay, that really means you've got an extra foot over here, and you've got an extra foot over here, yes? So it's really 102 feet. Does everybody see that? Same thing, up here and up here, 102 feet. All right? Now, if we take 102 times 102, it's not a huge difference. But it does add an extra 404 square feet onto the building. Well, that's an extra 404 square, you know what I'm trying to say. An extra 404 square feet of rent that we're going to have to pay. Okay? Well, if our rent, in this case, is $17.49, so that the 404 by itself, that's going to be an extra $7,000 a year. Okay, you follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So, and that's just the rental piece, okay? So that's not an insignificant factor to just automatically dismiss, you know, and not really, you know, take into consideration. Now, this was a super, super, super simple example, okay? Never is it this simple, okay? Because look at this room. Calculate the square footage of this room. You've got all sorts of these indentions and everything else, you know, so that if you were really calculating the precise dimensions of this room, you've got all sorts of geometry you're going to have to figure out if you're really going to be accurate, okay? Not saying that, you know, every single building is going to go to that level of complication. That, you know, most instances, you're probably going to have them going, yeah, okay, that wall to that wall, this wall to that wall, but it's not going to be precise. You follow what I'm saying? Okay? But yet, that's not really even the most complicated part. With a lot of buildings, you're not charging the tenants, in some cases, for common areas, like hallways, elevators, staircases. And every building is a little bit different. In some buildings, you do charge them a common area sort of fee, based upon maybe how much they're renting, you know, how many square feet they're renting. But in other cases, you don't. But that's going to have to be reflected, is my point. That's the reason I'm trying to go through this in terms of you thinking about it. That's going to have to be reflected in trying to get an accurate number for what is the actual leasable, chargeable square footage for the property. Does that make sense? Because like, for example, you go to lease an apartment. This is probably a better example. You go to lease an apartment, are you paying for the common spaces? No, at least not in your base rent. They're charging you rent based upon the confines of your apartment, and usually they will also include your balconies as square footage, okay? You may not pay attention to it, but if you've got a really big balcony in your place, I would be not surprised if that's not included automatically as part of the square footage calculation for your apartment whenever they go to calculate the per square foot charge. My point being is, well, yeah, it's usable space. It's not air-conditioned space, but it's usable space, okay? So I'm not saying it shouldn't be included, but the point is you've got to ensure that you're trying to be accurate about this. Okay. So all of that, once we get to that $174,930.64, we simply divide that by the 10,000 square feet, and that gives us this required rent per square foot of the $17.49. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about this model, this part of the model? Does it seem pretty straightforward to you? Yes or no? Okay. Is there any part about it that just doesn't make sense logically?
Just a question.
Yep.
You were talking about it gets detailed in like the square footage. Is it dependent on like the product type?
Sure.
So which is the most detailed? Which one?
Well, maybe if I had to overgeneralize,
right,
I would say the most difficult or challenging is probably going to be with office buildings, and I would say probably the least difficult is probably going to be industrial space. That would be my gross overgeneralization. Dustin, what do you think?
Yeah, office gets pretty complicated. There's like three numbers really that you look at: gross building area, which you talked about. There's leasable or rentable square footage, and then there's the actual usable square footage. So usable is like the interior of this room. But leasable or rentable might include what you're talking about, common areas like hallways, corridors, bathrooms, or shared. But it doesn't include vertical penetrations like elevators or stairwells.
Okay.
So, and the typical loss factor or add-on factor, which is the difference between usable and rentable for office, is about 15% for suburban office. But if you get into like downtown buildings, it can be as high as 20, 25%. And a lot of times tenants don't even know they're really paying on that. And that's when you're doing a tour and you walk through a space and they go, this room, you know, it doesn't add up to what's quoted on the flyer. And then that's when you have to explain to them they're paying an extra 20% in rent to use the hallway or the, you know, lobby of the building or whatever.
Yep. Okay. Make sense? Okay. All right, so let's move forward with the flip side of the model. Okay. Okay, so the backdoor approach. Okay? So here, I want you to do the same thing you did on the top half of the model. See if you can do all the calculations yourself to get down to the maximum supportable site acquisition cost. Okay, once again, just adding and subtracting for the most part, and dividing.
Professor, do we input the implied going in cap?
Not yet.
Okay.
Coming up with formulas now. You're saying expected occupancy rate. Oh, I'm so sorry, I got it wrong. Can you do this? in your paper.
Okay, everybody got it filled in? Oops. Okay, so let's go down through this. Let's kind of reverse our logic train. So here, we're starting out with the 10,000 square feet. All right. So we've got our 10,000 square feet. We know that our rent rate is $17.50 per square foot. So we just do the basic math of getting our 175,000, which is going to be our potential gross income. All right. So once again, we sort of start off over here, potential gross income. We've got our vacancies and collection losses. In this case, once again, we're told that we had an occupancy rate of 85%. So all we really have to do is to multiply this times 0.15, which is simply 1 minus 0.85, okay, to give us the 1.5, and then that's going to give us $26,250 as our vacancy and collection loss. Then we're going to add in our other income of 0, which now that's, doing the math on that, should give us $148,750 as our effective gross income. All right, so that gets us down to basically there. So you're seeing all we're doing is just flipping everything. Okay, makes sense? But this one is a little bit easier to do, kind of conceptually, at least I think so, because you're working kind of from the top down, okay, in terms of the logic piece and doing the calculations. All right, especially when you're doing them by hand. Okay, now, the next piece, we subtract out total operating expenses, which we put 50,000 there, all right, which then leaves us with our NOI, of the 98,750. Okay? So everybody's got down to that point, yes?
Yeah.
All right. Then we've got some of our loan information here, debt service coverage ratio, interest rate, and term. So the next piece that we've got to calculate, which is an identical situation as what we did above. We're just calculating our mortgage constant. So equal negative payment, open parentheses, C29 divided by 12, comma, D29 divided by 12, comma, 1 for our present value, comma, times 12, and that gives us our annual mortgage constant compounded monthly. Okay, am I matching up? Oh.
Is that back real quick?
You do it again.
Good. All right. Okay, now, so at this point, okay, what we are doing, this is the one part of this that if there is one part that's a little screwy in terms of the math, take a look at what you're actually doing. You're taking your expected net operating income, you're dividing it by your debt service coverage ratio, you're dividing it by your annualized mortgage constant, you're dividing it by your maximum loan to value ratio. Doing all three of those in sequence then gives you the maximum supportable project cost, okay? Now, it's kind of a shortcut to the math, but let's just sort of take a look, okay? So let's just, if you're putting it into the calculator, as an example, or into the spreadsheet, you're simply taking the 98,750 and you are dividing it by the debt service coverage ratio of 1.3. You are dividing that by the mortgage constant, the annualized mortgage constant of the 0.094895 and some change, and then you're taking that and you're dividing it by the maximum loan to value ratio of 80%, and then that is going to give us the maximum supportable project cost. Okay? All right, so let's just plug those in to see if they at least, it's going to be a little bit off because of rounding, but I just want to kind of illustrate that yes, it is, that is the math. 98,750 divided by 1.3 divided by 0.094895 and divided by 0.8. And once again, due to rounding, it's going to be a little bit off, but it's basically 1,599,085, and up here 1,597,000. So a difference of about basically a little over $1 and something, but only due to the rounding because I rounded off the annualized mortgage constant. Okay, make sense? Okay, now. Okay, so let's just kind of continue on with the logic on this. All right, I think we've explained the logic, I think, pretty well about the debt service coverage ratio, about the annualized mortgage constant, and the loan to value ratio. And so, once again, we get down to this number, the $1 million. So once again, the $1 million with some change, that represents the total amount that we could spend on this property, including land and construction costs. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? And then, so from that, we are then subtracting out the construction cost of whatever those have been estimated to be. And now we could, you know, kind of change things up a little bit, but let's just do one little quick calculation. What's our construction cost per square foot? Well, it's without really doing a whole lot of, without even punching it in the calculator, you get pretty darn close just by looking at it. Construction cost per square foot of the building.
75.
Basically $75 a square foot with some change, okay? Let's do the actual math. So equal, and then taking the construction cost divided by, in this case, we're sort of cheating because we're going with the leasable square feet and then not the gross building area. But once again, as I've said at the very beginning of all of this is a rough approximation, okay? The purpose of this model is just to give us a rough guide of what we could potentially spend on construction costs. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
75, is that a good number?
Once again, totally, completely depends on the product, totally, completely depends on the market. Because, like, for example, you know, if you take a state like New York, or take, you know, states that have high cost of labor due to labor unions, okay? Your labor costs are going to be through the roof. Compared to states like Texas, where labor costs are going to be dirt cheap, okay? Then you've got the other countervailing factor, land cost, okay? You take something like Florida, relatively high per square foot land cost, even higher, obviously, in New York, but once again, dirt cheap in Texas, you know, in most places. You know, so your overall construction cost, you know, is going to vary dramatically just depending on what part of the country or part of the world you're in, for that matter. Now, what I would use is something like RS means. There used to be, sometimes they keep fooling around with this and what is free and what is not, but if you type in RS means and you do like maybe a free cost estimator, let's see if that one works. price. That'll be the one that's going to look for. Yeah, this is still not the version I'm looking for. But let's just sort of take a look. And this has some localized cost per square foot for different building types, and you can sort of see, okay, the average cost, at least in, what's it, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, about $245 a square foot, whereas in California, sort of Central California, $369 a square foot. And then you go up to, say, kind of New York and obviously the Northeast, $391 a square foot. So to answer your question is, yes, it varies, okay? But what I'm looking for, and like I said, they used to have a really cool little thing, and I haven't used it in a while, but RS Means had this super easy to use per square foot kind of building cost calculator, and they may or may not have taken it off of their
I think they got rid of it.
there was even a free trial thing. Yeah. Well, anyway.
What's the next best source?
Well, there's also let's see, Dodge reports. There's
Call your local contractor.
Right.
yeah.
That's bad.
Well, I spent too much time looking for this, but I thought if somebody can find it, great. But what it would allow you to do, if you can find one, I'm sure there's one out there, but it will just allow you to type in your product type, type in your zip code, and then we'll give you kind of a range of what the construction cost would be for that particular area. That's really all you're really searching for, okay? So whatever source that you potentially could use for that, it at least gives you a ballpark idea. Okay, getting back to our model.
Somewhere in 50, over 10,000.
Okay, now, let's do this. All right, you've done everything you need to do for the quiz.
Professor, you didn't do the implied going-in.
I know.
Oh, that's why.
That's what I was just about to say. Okay, so basically, as I just said, we've done everything you need to do for the quiz for today, off of the spreadsheet. Now what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time kind of finishing out the spreadsheet with some of the other calculations that we can do to actually begin to do some return calculations and begin to make it a little bit more complex than what just the basic financial feasibility model is. So here's what I want you to do. Okay, and some of these, I mean, all of these are not filled in for you. I'm going to try to blow this up a little bit for you. We're going to focus on these first couple of years. All right. Now, let's just go down to this bottom piece and potential gross income. Now, all of this, in terms of all of this stuff, that's just this. Okay? See it? Potential gross income, vacancy, collection losses, so forth, so on. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
All right? Now, in this particular model, we actually did insert some other income, and we'll talk about that and explain that here in a second. But what I've done with this sort of extension of the model is basically to say, all right, let's make it a bit more realistic. And let's also, instead of it being kind of a static situation of a one-year kind of snapshot of performance, let's make some assumptions about growth rates of income, growth rates of operating expenses, and so forth, so on, so that we can actually calculate a 5-year sort of projection for the property to then be able to say, okay, well, what if we sell it and we get the cash flows from that, and what is that going to relate to in terms of an overall return? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, once again, this is not contained in the quiz. We're going to be doing this part right now, but in about 2 weeks, we're actually going to do a much more extensive version of this. So getting basically the understanding of this now would be very helpful. So it's not like you're going to be able to escape this, is what I'm trying to say, okay? All right. Now, let's start with just these first couple of years, okay? I'll kind of zoom in on those. All right, go ahead and populate these, the colored cells of, with the growth rate of 3%, I'm going to explain it, but 3%, the 4%, the 6%, and the 4%, okay? Everything else is blacked out on purpose because you're not going to be doing anything with those, okay? And then you can also go ahead and populate the 25,000 for the other income cell. Okay, so those are all inputs. Everything else is basically a formula-driven thing. All right, so let's just, first of all, talk about potential gross income and then the growth rate. Okay, so we've got 175,000 up there as our potential gross income. But to the left of it, we have assigned a growth rate of 3%. What does that mean? That means that each year we want to sort of grow that revenue. We want to grow basically our rental rate by 3% a year. Now that may be overly optimistic, it may not be. But the point being is that's what we're sort of making the assumption. Now it may just, but here's another piece of that. We can also, as we can talk about, within commercial leases, you can have what are called escalation clauses, okay? Which in essence means that the rent will go up and be by a certain percent each year, or by a certain dollar amount each year. And it could be just stated explicitly within the lease, but it can also be tied to some sort of an outside index that potentially would allow the rent rate to go up, or in some cases down, mostly never down. But in this case, we're just simply saying it's going to grow by 3%. Is everybody cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, to get to the second column, to year 2, the math is basically to do what? To take this, the first column, multiply it by 1 plus the growth rate. So you can just do 1, in terms of Excel, 1 plus the growth rate of 0.03, and that's going to get you to the next column. But in this case, we want to obviously cell reference that. Okay, we don't necessarily want to just type it in hard-code it. So see if you can do that real quick. See if you can match up with year 2 for the potential gross income by cell referencing. Don't hard-code it. So in other words, what I'm asking you to calculate is year 2, the 180,250. Okay. Now, I'll show you specifically what I did in terms of the way that I referenced it. So within cell B36, I did equal C36, which is obviously the 175,000, times 1 plus B36. Is that what you did?
Yeah.
Why did you put
Why did you put
plus?
plus? Though?
I didn't really have to. I think
Just trying to
because it's already a positive.
trying to trick us.
It's probably just me being overly cautious.
Where is the vacancy rate for?
What?
What's the vacancy rate in general for year 1, or is that just something we put in?
Well, no, it's being drawn from above.
Okay.
See, that's the thing. Okay,
So
let me
you-
make sure. Okay, that is clear as well. I forgot about that. My bad. So year 1, you're stealing that number
From
from B23.
Okay.
Okay. Because you're just pulling it down from your model.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Keep the static, the B23.
Well, for, probably not, well, because we're not gonna be copying it down quite that way. I mean, well, when we copy over, yes, we're gonna have to, deal with it differently, but I know where you're going. I'm gonna get there. Okay, so let's just do this, just to make sure that, let's just start with this column specifically. All right, so for cell C36, you're stealing that from cell B23.
Okay.
Okay, is everybody cool with that? That's just above in your mind. Okay, let's just go down the page. Okay, for your vacancy and collection losses,
Okay, yeah, that's what I did.
what I did was tell the cell C36, which is right above that, and then multiply it by 1 minus basically the B24, which is going to be your occupancy rate. Okay. And sometimes, once again, there's more than one way to sometimes get at that same number, okay? You may have chosen to get at it a little bit differently. That's okay, as long as you get the same answer, okay? All right. Moving down the page, okay, the 25,000, obviously that's a hard-coded number, okay? Moving on down. Okay, so